Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Karthik Ramakrishnan. I'm a professor of public policy here at UC Riverside. I also direct the Center for Social Innovation, and we are so happy to see all of you here today as we release our housing and community engagement toolkit. This is literally hot off the presses, I guess the digital presses. So if you go to our website, Eric, I believe it's up on our website now. Beth will be presenting the high-level overview of our toolkit, and then we'll have various reactors. I have the pleasure of having a fireside chat with Lisa Hershey from Housing California. After that, we'll have a panel with our government partners from the city and county of Riverside. And then after that, we're going to have our community panel with leaders in the housing and community development space from Orange County, as well as from the Inland Empire. That's all I have for my intro. I'll turn it over to Beth, who will be giving a high-level presentation of the toolkit, what it's intending to achieve, and we'll take it from there. Go ahead, Beth.
All right. Hi, everyone. I wanted to, again, thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. As Karthik mentioned, I'm Beth, and I'll be walking us through the toolkit. All right. So can we get to the next slide, please? So generally, we wanted to think about why engagement, right? Part of it is thinking about, the required housing element update, but also, on a really conceptual level, we felt this would be a prime opportunity to really dig in and think about engagement. What's been happening. Obviously, this, situation with COVID has really changed how we think about how we engage folks, how we can bring folks in. There's a lot of concerns about equity. There's things about digital divide, but we also wanted to think about it in a very positive way, like what innovations could help us increase engagement, and how can we support municipalities and community organizations alike. And on top of it, we really wanted to highlight that lived experiences are crucial and invaluable sources of information. And, there's a lot of it doesn't necessarily make it into the planning conversation for a variety of reasons. Part of it is definitely power imbalances, but there's a lot of talk about access, right? Like, do folks have access to technology? Are they familiar with it? Are they able to make meetings? There's a lot of questions surrounding, the idea of engagement generally. We obviously wanted to use the requirement of engagement as part of the housing element update to think about, on a very practical nuts and bolts level, what tools the municipalities have at their disposal. A lot of municipalities are doing some really great things right now. And we wanted to figure out, like, how can we use, what's out there in new and innovative ways. And another large kind of theme about this is, how can we better conceptualize the relationship between government agencies, community organizations, and the community themselves? How can we create more robust conversations and to increase trust? Because a lot of it is trying to make sure that voices are heard and that folks feel that their voices are actually really being heard by individuals. So then, why a toolkit? I personally was a government planner, and there was in a variety of capacities, and it wasn't always easy to determine what should happen outside of what's being prescribed. And so there's a lot of unknown fuzzy territory. We here thought that having this toolkit would actually be really helpful to maybe refresh on some options that are already out there, but to kind of start the conversation about what could be done with a lot of these tools we have now, particularly that remote environments are becoming much more commonly accepted. On that note, we also want to acknowledge that, this document is, one point in time, and that, obviously some of this information, like Zoom, for instance, will need to be updated in the future. So with that, talking about the state of the field and the opportunity to innovate, one thing that we really wanted to consider was that a lot of times what happens is we look at engagement as a sort of like one size fits all thing. And that doesn't necessarily work for every situation and every circumstance. And part of what we wanted to do was figure out, okay, well, we have a bunch of, these tools. how can we use web and mobile-based information sharing and participation options to figure out like how can we reach particularly hard to engage populations? Are there ways that we can, for instance, so one of the ways we wanted to think about this toolkit was to provide both remote options, but also to make sure that we paid attention to those folks that don't necessarily have access to, a lot of the technology that is, dependent on, being able to do Zoom, for instance. And so we wanted to make sure that there was always a low technology option that was provided, in addition to making sure that things could be done remotely. And what we thought of it is that we could look at these kind of options as a menu that you could kind of mix and match and figure out what works for your particular municipality. The idea behind this was that there would be different types of modalities and that you could hopefully create accommodations that were useful for a variety of individuals. One particular innovation that we thought was really exemplary was the American Planning Association had recently highlighted a municipality that had extended their comment period by simply posting their agendas way in advance, but also that they would allow comments to be done way in advance. And in that way, individuals would be able to, for instance, put in a comment at, let's say you have the graveyard shift, you might be getting off work at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you can put in a public comment there, and it would have just the same amount of weight as anybody who came in during a normal meeting and the normal comment open period. Another particularly innovative thing we found was brought us to Japan, where they looked at incorporating role playing, but they took a slightly different twist on it. Instead of simply asking folks for a different point of view, just saying like, okay, well, you put into yourself in somebody else's shoes. What they did was they took the shoes way into the future, several generations. And what they found was when they asked people to think about someone who was, say, 50, 100 years into the future, that this sort of started to shift individuals' thinking, because a lot of it is, like what impacts me now. But for instance, what impacts me now is that necessarily the most sustainable, the most equitable choice in the future. And they found that folks' opinions actually shifted the more that they did this exercise. What is on the screen right now is just an example of tools for engagement. And this brings us back to the idea of being able to sort of, mix and match. That, we have a lot of online tools, but we wanted to make sure that in addition to public meetings, workshops, and those types of sessions, that that there were a lot of ways that folks interact online, and particularly for certain communities that, like there's a lot that actually happens outside of these formal channels. A lot of what had actually been raised to us as well when we talked to individuals was that there's a lot of distrust in what happens with government entities, and that via using trusted messengers, folks within the community that are able to sort of interact between government and communities, that a lot of these online tools can be leveraged to help spread information through channels that communities who might be otherwise very cautious about what information is being pushed out would look at it in a different light. Let's fast forward, Carla, through to the next two slides. So this is, again, the menu of options. And then again, this was just one way to conceptualize what we were proposing as the tools. That the idea would be that, municipalities would be able to figure out, okay, well, certain of the things have been useful in the past. Maybe we could try different other options. But this was meant to recognize that, not everybody always has all the staff and time to do all of these things. And so maybe folks could pick, what works for them in their particular circumstance. One thing to note is that none of these are meant to be any better than the other. It's more of what works for your particular circumstance and in your particular, case. And that we wanted to be very mindful that every situation is unique, and that, the municipalities themselves would probably be best aware of, what resources they have, for instance, to be able to roll out these different participation options. Okay, next slide. When we think about innovation, a lot of times folks think that it has to be this really big and splashy thing, but realistically, it doesn't necessarily need to be. For instance, those two examples that I suggested were, one of them was looking at role playing that could be done in a workshop. It could even be done in a typical meeting. The idea is more just to get folks to think differently about how to communicate and how to communicate with each other. doing things like extending the comment period also, is not necessarily big and splashy, but it apparently had a huge impact on the amount of folks that were able to participate. One other thing is that we wanted to make sure that we, obviously utilize remote options. They've been extremely valuable. They've definitely extended the reach to many corners that maybe folks weren't able to participate before, but we want to make sure that, for instance, accommodating low-tech users was at the forefront. We didn't want this necessarily to rely completely on looking at technological tools. A really, really big one is that engagement is a really long-term investment, that it takes time to gain trust, particularly with communities that have been historically marginalized. As I mentioned in the beginning, one of the things that we really wanted to keep in mind was equity, right? There's been a lot of power imbalances, and there are reasons why communities are often hesitant to participate. And, part of this is really looking at like, well, how do we ensure that folks understood that both their voices are important, but that they have, the power within them to be able to voice their concerns. We don't, we want to make sure that folks feel comfortable in doing so. And there was a lot of feedback where folks would go out and ask so-and-so, and they would be like, well, no, I'm not going to participate. Why would I do that? It's already a foregone conclusion. And, that's really telling, because if folks think that it doesn't matter, then they're not necessarily going to use their time that could be spent elsewhere. And we wanted to make sure that when we talked about it being a long-term investment, that, we're, talking about engaging communities, that, government and communities are working hand in hand, that we're creating the type of engagement infrastructure that's going to help build up communities, that helps build capacity within, but also that make sure that we're looking at the type of, communication infrastructure is appropriate, right, for the different types of audiences. One other thing, and this is also part of the long-term investment, is making sure that we say thank you. Showing gratitude is really important, and it's extremely important when working with folks that haven't necessarily participated before. We want to make sure that they have a really positive experience, and that they feel like their voice was heard, so they will hopefully come back. Next slide. One of the big takeaways we wanted to kind of talk about is that we want engagement that is effective, efficient, and equitable. And we, basically government agencies and communities are really in a partnership here when we talk about community engagement, because we're both working together to find similar goals. And one way I wanted to think about this is sort of like a triangle, right? Because the idea is that a triangle is one of the strongest shapes due to its construction. Next slide, please. So if we think about this as, right, a triangle, right, which is one of the strongest shapes, we can think about it as, the three sides being sort of what we can think of as conceptualizing our shared roadmap, right? So one of them is identifying mutually shared values. We all are looking for, our engagement to be equitable. We want things to happen in a timely way, but we also want to make sure that we are effective in what we're trying to do. A big thing is that we need to make sure that information is clear and accessible. There's a lot of jargon that's being used. Folks don't always know where to find things on websites. It's not really the easiest thing to navigate for folks who aren't necessarily intimately involved in the process. And we wanted to, say that this is definitely a shared value. A big other thing is to clearly communicate the rules of the game. A lot of what happens is that folks aren't necessarily aware of how the planning process happens, and that because of that, they aren't necessarily able to engage as effectively as possible. So for instance, folks may not understand what a comment period is or what a public meeting is meant to do. And the idea behind this is to make sure that folks, understand that this is what happens, this is why it happens in this particular timeline, because at least individuals then understand, okay, these particular things happen in this way for a reason. Okay, all right, next slide.
Okay, I think that's it, Beth, on your end, unless you have any final wrap-up comments to make.
No, that's good. We're ready for questions if anybody has any.
So Lisa, welcome. Welcome to our panel. Yeah, we just love to get some early thoughts about the toolkit. But before we do that, Lisa, can you just say a little bit more about yourself and Housing California and why a toolkit like this is part of the work that you've been doing, both personally and the organization over several years?
Yeah, thanks so much, Karthik, for inviting me to share space with you and have a chat. Always love to do that. Look forward to doing it in person again. And I just have to say that, we had our huge annual conference, and so what you just experienced is huge, and just want to name it and appreciate the grace of everyone moving through it. It is the reality of the moment that we're in. So my name is Lisa Hershey. I serve as the Executive Director for Housing California. And we really have, as Karthik knows, a vision for creating a California with homes, health, and prosperity for all and thriving communities. I'm also a Redlands native, so the Inland Empire is near and dear to my heart, and I really appreciate all the work that Karthik, the Center for Social Innovation, and all of you that are in the space and place from local government, community-based organizations, and community are here with us today. This cool toolkit is near and dear to my heart, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about our structure and why it's so relevant for us at Housing California. But I will just say that we reach through our vision through three strategic directions: shaping narrative, shifting and building power through multi-sector coalitions and community organizing networks, which is key and core to this conversation. And it's all about changing policy. And we fundamentally believe that we do this better together. So in terms of this toolkit, Housing California is super excited because we feel like it really aligns with our values. We believe strongly in creating transparency and trust, reducing inequities, and developing solutions for communities most impacted by the lack of housing affordability. We're also really committed to developing leadership among affordable housing residents who themselves have experienced housing instability and homelessness. And as Beth aptly named, people with lived expertise, because they bring their stories and join us add a seat at the table to actively participate in local and state policymaking. And we truly, as Beth also acknowledged, and this center brings to heart, recognize that people with lived expertise are often excluded from planning and policymaking processes, really leading to that lack of trust and buy-in. But even more importantly, leading to policies that may not truly benefit communities most in need, which have historically been left behind. And I'll just say lastly, in some cases, planning and policies do not include these communities that result in unintended consequences, right? That could have been avoided if folks most impacted actually were sitting at the table, meaningfully engaged in the process. So operationalizing this toolkit will go a long way towards avoiding these unintended burdens.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. So the next thing I wanted to dig into, and you'd mentioned this, but generally the vision for Housing California, but I know that we're in the midst of the Roadmap Home 2030. And for disclosure, I serve on the Policy Advisory Committee for Roadmap Home. Can you say more about that, and also how various stakeholders and community members in the Inland Empire can meaningfully engage in the work ahead, both in the next few months, but also the decade to come?
Yes, Karthik. First of all, thank you for being part of our Policy Advisory Committee. So grateful to have your engagement and the folks sitting at this table. And I really want to start at the essence of this, which is our Resident United Network, which I briefly mentioned. But this is really an effort with our local and regional partners like Center for Social Innovation, the Southern California Housing Collective, Kennedy Commission, and SCAMF, who are helping us cultivate our resident leaders who are trained in housing policy and storytelling so they can be ambassadors that help connect the lived experience to policy solutions. And fortunately, through this locally connected, regionally organized statewide network, we have resident leaders living in our affordable housing developments who have lived expertise in housing stability and homelessness, who sit at the table and help guide all of our work. The roadmap that Karthik just named, but anything we do, both informing and shaping our thinking, developing our annual policy platform, and advancing our long-term solutions. And we see this really as key and core to moving our work most effectively. And I will name Housing California, prior to 7 years ago, we were a lobbying shop. We worked in the Capitol, we paid lobbyists to do our work. And what we knew was we weren't winning. And part of the reason we weren't winning is we weren't including people with the lived expertise who really understand what it takes to create transformative change. So our investment in RUN, along with all of our partners statewide, including the Inland Empire with Azalea, have really transformed the way we do business and become trusted community leaders and messengers that the toolkit envisions. So this principle has really played out through our roadmap values, really demonstrating it in the Roadmap Home process. And just really quickly, the Roadmap Home, or the California Roadmap Home 2030, has a vision to create a California with homes, health, and prosperity for all in thriving communities by 2030. And with that, we have 4 audacious goals: to build 1.2 million affordable homes, to get folks off the street, so the 150,000 that experience homelessness chronically and the 300,000 who are housing stable right now, to keep people in their homes, and to center racial justice. So we've got those 4 audacious goals. We've got a 5-pronged equity-centered framework to really flip the script and reimagine how to do this work effectively. And we have centered our resident leaders in every part of the process. And I will acknowledge that we didn't do it as effectively as we needed to from the beginning. And we did a racial equity analysis with Race Forward, called us on it. Even though our intention was there, we did not do it effectively. And now Zella and Willie sit at our core team, guiding, making the biggest decisions with us, and are going to be fellows through the whole implementation process. So it just reminded us how, even with the intention and built in, it's not simple. It takes clear intention, commitment, and trust. And we know how much stronger this work is going to be in the design because we are in partnership with government, are in partnership with community-based organizations, and we are in partnership with our resident leaders who don't have a folding chair, but have a permanent seat at the table. So I'll just say lastly, I'm super excited, Karthik, because this toolkit provides a guide that I think we all need to help local planners and policymakers, community-based organizations, and resident leaders know how to come together in all the different ways that you just referenced to make this change in the way we do business and come out with really profound impact like the Roadmap Home, which will move us to create that California, to create the Inland Empire, the localities, the regions, the state, and the nation we all want to be a part of.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. And I know we're at time. There's some questions people had in the chat, and I think some colleagues are responding in terms of what does affordable housing mean? And I'm sure that'll be a through line in a conversation we'll have throughout today. Thank you so much. And also thank you for providing that history of Housing California's own journey. I think a lot of times folks think that policy solutions can be designed entirely by government and say some key interest groups, but we know that if you don't have community voice in there, we're really missing out. It's not just important, as Beth noted, from a policy equity perspective, but from an effectiveness and efficiency perspective. It's just so much more inefficient if you draw up all of these plans and you realize at a very late stage that major aspects of the community is not on board. So thank you so much for all that you've laid out today. And we look forward to working with our community partners, some of whom we'll hear from later on in terms of advancing the Roadmap Home 2030 work in the months to come.
Thank you so much, Karthik. It's an honor and a pleasure to work with you always, and so excited about this effort moving forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I think I'm now tossing it over to Beth, who will be leading our panel with government agency officials.
All right. Hi. All right. So I believe we have Carrie Harmon and Moises Lopez here joining us today from the government side. And we were hoping we could get some brief reactions from you about, coming from your perspective. You folks are obviously the ones there who are hitting the ground, running the meetings, trying to get folks to participate. There's a lot of things that are mandated, obviously, but we would like to hear your thoughts on how, for instance, we can best support your efforts to engage more folks in this process.
Carrie, go for it. I'll let you start. I think it's a huge challenge, and it really is a huge shift for local government and how we previously done this in the past. We had more transactional relationships with the community as we shopped a plan, did updates to the housing element, whatever it was more of a one-off. And I think that what we're moving towards is a long-term relationship with the community. I think the city of Riverside, my colleague Moises, has already done that and laid a lot of groundwork in just how their neighborhoods are organized and all of their work around that. And when I worked at the city, that was definitely a starting point. And I think they have a more robust relationship with the community at the city level, and definitely the county is now embarking on that. And I think one of the best examples and where we both worked on a project is the Transformative Climate Community project and grant that's on the east side, and our engagement with both community-based organizations in shaping that huge project and grant, but also in the individual community members. So I don't know if Moises would like to speak in more detail about that project.
Yeah, that's a great project. It has as its centerpiece an affordable housing project, and it will include a variety of other green initiatives, from water efficient landscaping to solar on roofs to green transportation infrastructure, making the community that much more livable for the folks that live and work there. So Carrie's absolutely right. That's an excellent example of how we're transitioning in and how we interact and engage our community. That project alone, I think, has 10, 12 different partners who are all charged with different areas of managing that grant, and the centerpiece of it being community engagement. The city's actually in the process of updating its housing element, so the toolkit is perfectly timed. So kudos to you and the team for preparing the document, and we're very fortunate that some of the strategies that are identified in the toolkit are things that we're currently doing and trying to engage our community to be a little bit more proactive and build upon the work that we've done over the years to build relationships, not just with the city's 26 neighborhoods, but the multitude of community groups that currently operate and engage us on a regular basis. Those are platforms that we need to continue to engage in, because they're those trusted community partners that you referred to earlier that have that credibility in the neighborhood, so that we can continue building and working through them through those relationships. And if I can give a shameless plug, part of our strategic plan that was adopted by our mayor and city council recently included a component to, it's titled high performance government, and a critical part of that is civic engagement. In fact, we're in the process now of developing and updating our citywide engagement policy tool that will be developed in large part by members of our community who will help develop that process to make sure that we're communicating in the manner that they believe is most effective for themselves. And so we have a workshop on this actually tomorrow morning, a virtual workshop on this tomorrow morning. So I encourage everybody to participate in that process and be part of that process to develop that tool.
That's great. It sounds like both of your sides are doing, really hitting the ground running with trying to get folks, really looped in. Carrie, I wanted to follow up on your comment that, that this, it historically may have been a one-off, and, trying to make it more long-term. And I think this sort of dovetails into some of the things you were saying, Moises, as well. I would be curious to find out, other than, just time and money, what else, would help you in your efforts to, engage more individuals, make it more long-term, try and, like you were mentioning, Moises, is like, engage more individuals, bring in more trusted messengers. Like how could, what would help your efforts really, do you think maybe get some fruits out of those labors?
Well, in reaching out to community partners, we look at it as a kind of a two-way relationship. We can certainly reach out, but we need that relationship to continue onward and grow over time. So we're willing to commit the resources in terms of staff and resources, the limited resources we have to kind of grow that relationship. So I think, there needs to be a commitment on not just our part to continue that process forward, but also on our community partners to just help us serve as those platforms through which we can communicate more effectively with the community.
Yeah, and I think one of those platforms that was particularly helpful for me in carrying back community needs to my bosses and to the Board of Supervisors was the Wednesday morning calls that Karthik convened, where it was a broad, very broad section of community-based organizations who, and panels that address specific issues that were really urgent in the community at that time. And, it's gone on now for almost a year, and I was able to take information that I gleaned from that back so that it informed funding decisions. So I think those, long-term, I know probably it wasn't set up to be around for a year, but that was very helpful. I think as a career government employee that, we really need to be out in the community probably 70% of the time. Luckily, Moises and I have jobs where we're able to do that. But like planners, Beth, when you're a planner, you don't get to be out in the community 50% of the time, the majority of your work. And so as we evolve government positions, we need to ensure that that is a duty that is, it's not just about paperwork, that community work is like a daily part of the work that's being done.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I believe we're at time, but I really wanted to thank you. It sounds like both, you and Carrie, you and Moises are really involved in, working within the systems that we have right now to try and lay the framework for lasting engagement. And I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Great. I think now we have Carla Lopez Del Rio, who's going to be facilitating the conversation with our community partners. Carla.
Hi, thank you so much. So if I can invite Cesar and Karen to come. All right, So let me start with this. We just heard from Beth, Carrie, and Moises, that there's efforts that need to be made on the side of the institutions, but how can we help the institutions would be a great way to segue into this conversation. And I would like to introduce you before we answer that question a little bit. If you could say just a little bit about who you are and what you do with your organizations. And then we can start embarking on that conversation of like, how do we get community to participate also? So go ahead, perhaps Karen, you can start.
Sure, thank you, Carla. I'm Karen Suarez. I am the new director for Uplift San Bernardino with the Making Hope Happen Foundation. And I'm also the co-chair for the Inland SoCal Housing Collective.
And can you tell us a little bit about what the Inland SoCal Housing Collective is?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're trying to do is we just come together, housing organizations as well as service providers, and really, and anyone that has an interest in housing comes together so that we can come up with solutions on how we can make sure that everyone in our Inland Empire region has a home. So we share resources. We have 4 pillars that we work under. We have a wealth building and preservation pillar. We have our educate and advocate for public policy. We have a working group focused on expansion of housing solutions. And we also have an increasing regional engagement where we're trying to connect all of the amazing place-based work that's happening in our market to kind of come together in a forum and share best practices and identify opportunities where we can align our work and also look at potential funding resources that could really benefit the entire region.
Thank you, Karen. Cesar.
Good morning, Cesar Covarrubias. I'm the Executive Director of the Kennedy Commission. The Kennedy Commission is a nonprofit organization here in Orange County that works to expand affordable housing opportunities for low-income working families in our county. But we also realize that we have a role to play regionally, and we have a role to play at the state level, and our partners with many of you on the call and others who are trying to move forward with increasing not only access, but equity and housing, but also building communities. And I think that's the spirit of all the work that we're doing here is collaboration, really invest and make sure that people who live in our communities benefit from those investments.
So let's take on, thank you so much for that. Let's take on that question. Let's segue into what do you feel in your experience are the best ways to engage community?
I can start on that if you wish. Well, I think it all starts with a vision, and we've been hearing a little bit about that through the conversation today, is what do you want your community to look like? And how do you engage people who live there today? Because many times I think we start off with a vision that maybe does not include people who live there today. And the first step I would think is to think about who are the stakeholders that you're trying to engage. How do we include them in that vision? How do we include them to form that vision early on and be able to have that access? So I really believe that some of the best practices that were mentioned today, and I'm really grateful to have heard the work that's being done in Riverside, for example. Specifically, what we would want to see is the intentional outreach, the intentional partnerships and collaboration with groups that have access to people that traditionally are not part of the process. And that's really refreshing to see. And it's really the starting point, because you see that a lot of investment, especially now because Orange County, LA, Riverside, many areas are really impacted with limited growth opportunities, right? So a lot of it is reuse of properties. And that really is going to mean that you're going to go into a neighborhood and change that neighborhood. So we really have to be mindful that you are creating a vision of those individuals participating in that vision and participating in ultimately the outcome, and hopefully that they remain in that property, because the most valuable thing that we see is enriching these communities and also improving these communities, but making sure people stay there and enjoy those benefits. Because it's very common that we uplift neighborhoods and then we see traditionally called gentrification. So, and I think it all starts because we didn't really engage those community members and have them in mind in the process. So I would say that those are kind of my best practices would be do an analysis of who's in the neighborhood or the area that you're thinking about investing or changing, and engage them and work with trusted partners who already are working with community members there. The traditional homeowner associations will show up to all the meetings. Individuals who are in apartments traditionally don't get those notices because you're not the property owner. So how do you engage people who are engaging them already and ultimately making part of the vision?
And sometimes it's the unusual suspects, right? Like sometimes faith-based organizations fill that role. Sometimes it's a local CDC. It could be anybody in the community that takes leadership. It's just creating that vision is so important, I think, as you were saying, Cesar, because it's difficult to have a relationship where you don't know what you want, right? So if you go and you engage your public officials or if you engage staff at the city, but you don't have a cohesive vision, it's very difficult to then be able to collaborate, right? So thank you for that. Karen, what do you think? What are the best practices you've seen?
Yeah, I think like my thoughts are around like is like really intentionally looking at the strengths of your community, right? And like bringing out the best, bringing like that the communities and the cities can work together on those narratives so that, you know, everyone is consistently affirming that the positive things that are coming out of the community, the experiences, even where there's challenges, right? Like when we identify the solutions that we can go at it together. And so, and I think consistently acknowledging that people's lived experience is experience, and that community members and that they're so valued because of their lived experiences and the contributions that they're making in their own neighborhoods. I do think that the narratives and even the way that we present things on, you know, community websites and the way that we're writing emails to our community residents, all of that could affirm just like what a valuable individual and families that these residents are for municipalities. You know, because what's a community if you don't have your citizens?
So, you know, let's put a little bit of a pushpin right there because I want to come back to it. But now that we have this, you know, new normal of COVID-19, I think it was very apparent that a lot of things were not what we thought. And I think it goes in every direction, right? So what have you seen under COVID-19 that these new practices that have come up as, you know, ingenious ways to just stay connected and continue forward? Do you see any opportunities that you think might change the way we do things and that open up this opportunity to create better engagement?
I would say that the current pandemic has really pointed out inequities in every way, right? Obviously, communication, technical divide is a big challenge, but it's really pointed out that there needs to be additional investment from us as nonprofits and also from cities and hopefully from our foundation partners to build more capacity and more technology knowledge within our residents, because if that's the new normal, we have to be able to help provide additional laptops or connectivity, whatever it may be, right? And for all of us to have that technical support, right? It's a challenge to really navigate these new systems. And for folks who have done this for a while, technology is challenging. So you need to be able to build capacity with residents to be able to understand these processes and also create those spaces, right, to do it. It's not the right space to bring forth a community individual who doesn't have this knowledge into a space that's already preformed for that. I think we need to start where the residents are at, incorporate them into that. Again, building those partnerships, I think it's going to be crucial. The other part that is very apparent is that we need to create broader collaboration. It can't just be because we need input into a specific plan. I think our partners in County of Riverside have mentioned this in the presentation, that there's an intentionality to build relationships that are going to be long-term, and that we are educating folks about the process, that it's not just about the general plan amendment or the housing element. There's a continuity to that work. And ultimately, the initial planning part of it is the first start, and then ultimately comes the implementation, the development, and all that work, right? So part of my hope is that we as partners collaborate on grants, maybe that also can help explore how we build nonprofit capacity and also build resident capacity to be able to do that in partnership with our local cities to make their job easier, to make our job easier, and ultimately to increase the capacity and engagement.
Okay, so Karen, I want to, because of time, I would like to ask you another question. So let's talk about, okay, now we're talking about how the responsibility of the community, there's responsibility on the sides of the communities to come together, have a vision, engage, right? And develop relationships. So two quick questions within that. The first one is, you had mentioned in our talks getting ready for this toolkit that youth is really important. So can you talk about a little bit about the materials that we were talking about and why youth is important? And then this relationship, the idea of building relationship that Carrie mentioned at the end and Lisa mentioned at the end of their presentation. What about relationships? It sounds, relationship is just, it's just a word, but like, what does that mean? What type of relationship are we supposed to have?
Yeah, so one is, so okay, so I'm just gonna share my personal story, because like as we were working through this toolkit, right? Like I called my mom. Okay, I called my mom and I'm just like, Mom, if a city did this, would you come? If they did this, and you know, honestly, she was just like, no. But I was like, okay, what if I invited you, right? And my mom was like, yes. And I'm like, you know, the power is on all of us. Everyone that's in this call today, like it is up to us to like bring our families along. And I think about young people, right, who are super tech savvy. If cities are implementing these cool ways to engage their citizens and including youth, like I love that some of our cities have youth councils as part of their city commissions, you know, like get the phone, use the social media technology and empower our youth with like easy terminology for them to be able to have these conversations with their family. Because I remember growing up and serving as a translator and helping my parents have an understanding of like what I needed at school and so on and so forth. So I think that another mechanism is like, and because we're planning for the next, what is it, Cesar? It's 8 years, right? For the housing element, right? Yes. We're planning for the next 8 years. And so what about our kids right now? Like my daughter is 5, she's going to be 13. So it's like, wow, like we're planning for the future too. So that's so important for us to get young people incorporated into this conversation. And what an empowering way to have a young person, bring their families to that meeting. And I also love that, I know with COVID it's harder, social distancing, but some of these consultants and cities are getting really clever and doing like pop-ups in different neighborhoods and taking stuff mobile, like on a car and connecting with neighborhoods and residents. And so I want to challenge all of us on this call today that we learn a little bit more about how we can get engaged and bring our families and our friends along for the ride.
Okay, but what about the relationships that we are building with our institutions? What are they supposed to be about? We want to make cool outreach and get people to get engaged, but in the end, it's because this connection is supposed to deliver something for us. What are we supposed to be doing with these relationships, really?
Well, I think it's to help build a vision and ensure that we're having a mutual understanding, and that the importance of having a relationship with the city people is because they're also community members, right? These are also your neighbors. And even when they don't live in your own city, like we still live in a region together. We live in the Inland Empire, right? We're Riverside in San Bernardino County. It's just important to build relationships with people and be able to have that connection with individuals, and because they also serve. Like our public servants serve to help translate this legal terminology that comes from the state, that comes from the cities, that comes from, all these technical zoning and planning and just real technical types of terms. And they help serve as translators so that we have an understanding of how that impacts us in our daily living, right? And then how the resources that our cities have, how they use it to build and make sure that our parks are safe and make sure that we have the utility infrastructure that we need. And also to make sure that we have the infrastructure that we need in the future. And so I think that's why it's important to build a relationship with cities, is so that we can have an understanding of what they can have an understanding of what our needs are, but we can also have an understanding of what constraints they're working under, as far as policy goes, and as far as procedures and all these things that make up a city, and the rules that make up a city, and how they have to operate. And if we don't understand those things, there's going to be a lot of miscommunication, right? And when we get angry and like things aren't working out the way we want them to. So that's the importance and the value of building a relationship with your city officials and your staff. And they're public servants. They're there to serve.
I was a public servant at one point in time, and I remember I was in the census outreach, and I was coordinating outreach, and I had not answered my census. Sometimes we forget that we were so busy trying to count people that we are part of that, of the residents. We are also residents. Planners are residents of their own communities and their own cities. So we can always connect at a human level, I think, when we come together. Cesar, would you like to wrap up? We are at time. Maybe you have one more thought that you want to share?
Well, I think I would just add on that it's important also to see that these networks are important to solve these government solutions, right? And social solutions. We need government, we need also the community, we need advocates. And in these spaces, we're able not only to collaborate on solving issues, but also think about potential solutions. We have statewide partners that can help with legislation. We have local governments also that can work with nonprofits. We, as the Kennedy Commission, are a large collaborative that includes residents, but also includes professionals who work in planning, who work also in affordable housing. So it's a broader spectrum that we bring all these individuals together and are able to align all our priorities. So thank you all for all the great work that you're doing out there to make that vision possible and align all these great people together.
We really appreciate your time, your experience, your passion, the work you've done, and being here with us today. So I'm going to pass it back to Karthik because I know we're running out of time. And I'll see you actually shortly.
Great. Well, thank you, Carla, and thank you to all of our partners, not just those who've spoken today, but also those who we've engaged with over the last few weeks in terms of putting this together. I think that is it for our session. What we are hoping to do in the coming weeks and months is to take this to various venues, including to various association of governments, local governments at the county and city level, and to work with city planners as well as with community organizations. I think just lifting up both what Beth and Carla have said consistently throughout is that this is not something that is only solved by government or only solved by community. It is truly a partnership, and we'd like to approach it in that spirit. I know some of the questions that came in the chat included, what are the kinds of resources that are available? We've listed a set of resources in terms of tools that folks could use. We know that many community organizations as well as cities are struggling in terms of financial resources. One of the few silver linings, I think that's been mentioned before and is featured in our report, is the availability of technology that can make community engagement and input more convenient, more cost-effective, and more accessible, even though it does introduce some digital divide issues and also potential language barrier issues. It at least allows those who might be otherwise stuck in commutes or at work and away from their city of residence to be able to engage. So we have many remote options as well as options of surveys and other ways to extend and deepen community engagement. And we hope that you find all of this helpful. I'm going to turn it over to you, Carla, because the next segment, we do have some additional time, and we really wanted to have more engagement and community voices, including those on the call, and who are not designated as panelists, to be able to offer their thoughts.
Yes, so we want to welcome everybody to stay. We want to open up our microphones and we want to have a conversation. We actually have Damien O'Farrell, and I don't think I see you on the. Damien is going to join. Oh, hey, Damien. So Damien's going to join me to help us lead this next section. We are trying to have a conversation with all of you. We want to hear what your reactions are, what your experience are. We have a ton of experience here in the room with all of the people that have joined us, and we would like to hear from you. We want to learn from you as well. So Damien, if you could introduce yourself just briefly and kick it off.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carla. Thank you for having me here. I think this is an exciting project. Again, Damien O'Farrell, CEO of Parkview Legacy Foundation. We're a healthcare conversion that focuses on the social determinants of health and wellness. And housing is absolutely an essential piece of our overall health and wellness and our ability to pursue the lives that we want. So making sure that the entire community is involved in creating the communities that are healthy for everybody is very important for us. And as Carla mentioned, this toolkit is not meant to be something that's just something that's a box checker, but something that actually transforms communities. And in order to do that, it's going to continually evolve and it needs to include the community's comments. And so the first thing that we'd like to have, we have a few questions that we wanted to buzz through, and I would love to hear the input of those of you that are community members and non-professional practitioners of this stuff, right? Not getting paid to do it, but are here because you're concerned for what's going on in your community and the housing situation. So if you can put your name in the chat, that would be helpful, because if there are some dead spaces, I would like to try to call on some folks. I did take some notes of some of you that I seen on the call, and I'll.
Oh, and Damien, might I also suggest, folks, if you can turn on your cameras if you're able, it'd be nice to see the fuller spectrum of folks that are here.
Yes, love to see you.
Yes, thank you.
And Damien, I wanted to add to this, a little bit of context. When Damien and I were getting ready for this, we asked the question, and you don't have to raise your hand, okay? You don't have to raise your hand, but did you participate in your housing element update? And if you didn't, think about it as a resident. If you close your eyes and just put yourself in your desk right now, and you're a resident of your city, and you wanted to make change, what change do you want to make? Who do you want to talk to about it? Where would you start? Who do you talk to? And when you think about it as a professional, well, I was behind Zoom trying to get things done, for this other meeting. That's the reality that we're all facing. So we would like to think about it with a solutions hat on, first of all, and as a resident, professionals and advocates together.
Absolutely. So the first question that we'd like to have some of you respond to is, and I know that some of you have had a little bit longer time to look at the toolkit. Some of you saw it for the first time. Some of you may be looking at it on the, sorry, there's construction going on in the suite next door. You may have linked to it from the chat box, but the question is, what have you seen or heard about this toolkit that you find the most promising if cities or agencies were to implement that?
And feel free to jump in.
This is Tom Donahue. I'm with the Riverside Neighborhood Partnership. We're basically, our mission is to inform and educate and then advocate for what's going on in our neighborhoods. We have a website, we do a newsletter. We've been involved in the housing update for the last 2 sessions. There's one next week. The big challenge for us is to, as you all mentioned, is getting the information out, because most neighbors are low tech. And when are the meetings scheduled? Are they when people are working? Are they on the weekends or after hours? City staff is strapped on when they can use their resources. Also the technology. We're on a Zoom call today, but most governments are moving to Teams, Microsoft Teams, because of the efficiency of the technology. So now there's going to be a new technology training effort that we're going to have to adjust to in a low tech.
We need to be everything on Microsoft Teams and OneDrive. We need to move everything off of Google, because Google really screwed me up. I mean, all of Norris Files fucking gone. But like all
I love technology.
There we go. Go on, Tom.
The good thing is we're finally having the conversation in Riverside neighborhoods. As Moises said, this Saturday, Community Engagement 101 is starting. That's the front face. It's a community education phase. And internally, the city departments are having this discussion as well. And at some point, we'll merge together in what those plans are. The big thing is knowing, getting to know who is the developers are. Because are the developers the enemy of your neighborhood, or are they your partner? And are your elected officials, what's the role of our elected officials? The elected officials have the biggest megaphones in our communities. They have the biggest outreach. We're fortunate in the city of Riverside that we have strong IT support and technology and experience to get the messaging out through social media, through the dreaded next door community. It's, oh my God, it's just ugly out there. But it's a place where people do communicate. And part of the challenge that we have is getting all the voices heard. And some of those voices are very anti-government and lack trust in government. So part of our mission is to, how do we moderate and make sure the community knows that they have responsibilities in this process too. It's not just what's expected of government. It goes back to, and I heard it from several people, is what's expected of our neighborhood participants in these programs. We have to be informed. We have to agree on what the facts of the issues are. The biggest concerns we have in projects are the dreaded, oh, we just put together 5 new change orders, or this has an environmental negative impact. Well, one person's negative impact is another one's major impact. And making sure that when we make decisions, I think Riverside is going toward a triple bottom line approach to make sure the social, the financial, and the environmental impacts are all in balance. That really came out to play when you talk about warehouse development. Right. And when you're putting large housing projects into infill areas throughout the city, people really need and are hungry for information, and information that's in conversational language. There is so much.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. You can cut me off. I'm used to the 3-minute cutoff. That's fine.
No, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to build a little bit on what you said. I'll let Quinn take the next one, but I'm thinking about something that you just said, because It's not just about engaging locally, like how do we as residents learn to engage at the state level, right? Especially for areas like ours that have not been very strong in presence in Sacramento and other areas where a lot of these discussions happen. It's important to think about that. But before we go there, let's talk to Quinn real quick about this question that Damien posed.
Hi, my name's Quinn. I am a Moreno Valley resident, and I'm also working with a nonprofit called the Listening Post Collective, and our work is focused on local journalism and uplifting that. And from the work that I've been doing, what I'm understanding is, and some of the things that have been mentioned prior to now by some of our speakers, is that there really does need to be more of an effort on the part of local government to proactively talk about what is happening. And I think that there needs to be more of an effort to work with local media makers, local journalists, whoever it is that's getting the word out, whether that's making more of an effort to work with legacy media like the San Bernardino Sun and the Press Enterprise to say, hey, we're having these events, these discussions about, the development of the Carousel Mall or something like that. And so that way residents are aware of these happenings. But alongside that, as a resident who's now becoming more involved in my community, I do feel that what was also mentioned is accessibility in the terms of vocabulary and education around that is extremely valuable. There's been a learning curve for me. I will acknowledge that. So I can't speak eloquently about what all is going on, though I'm learning so much today and through continually doing this. And I'm privileged to be able to have the time and capacity to do this, right? Which is why things like workshops and efforts on the part of not just the nonprofits and local community leaders, but on our local government to make efforts to help educate the community that, like it's been mentioned, they're a part of, has had a significant impact on myself. I'll put it that way.
So let's say that the city does the effort of putting together a leadership program, and I've seen them in many cities, they have leadership programs. Yeah. The responsibility of the community is to get people there, right? Sometimes you see that they do all this effort and they put together all these materials and like the staff is really good, and then 3 people show up. And right, go ahead.
I agree. A woman earlier had spoken, and I have her name written down, but that it is true. I do see that you need to involve your family and your friends and make that effort to get them here with you. And I can see even just from a meeting like this, like I could have other attendees on Zoom with me. So I hear you.
And guess what? This is not the last time we're going to meet over Zoom, because we're planning on meeting more and building. This is a small group of 37 people. We're planning on bringing more and actually getting this toolkit to breathe life into it, right?
I recognize some of these faces.
Yeah, Carla, just wondering if one thing I could just quickly add though and ask is, yes, these opportunities are created, but communities, there's so many barriers, right? So, I mean, at least from the civic engagement literature, which, I've been working on since my dissertation days, right? You need to create the opportunities, but it's, the factors that matter are skills, motivation, and then mobilization, right? And so it will take some effort, hopefully less effort over time, but those early investments to reduce the barriers, increase awareness, and to really, motivate and mobilize, can make a huge difference down the line.
Yes, thank you, Chris.
And I would also add to that I think there's an intentionality of involving the community in the design of outreach. If you involve them early on, there's more motivation to be able to participate, to understand why there's a role for them. So I would just add that to the conversation.
Well, I think that's an important part of the conversation. It's been mentioned several times. And I think if you want to weigh in on either of the first 2 questions, which one was asked, which is what do you find most promising? The second is what Quinn was touching on, which is what do you feel like is 1 or 2 things that cities really need to hear in order to implement this well? And one of the things I heard Quinn saying is better use local media in a better way to reach different audiences. But the third, and you can weigh in on either of those, but the third question really has to do with this idea about relationship, right? moving from a transactional situation where we're only talking with one another or reaching out to one another when we need to, when arena comes up, when a housing development is up, to actually being in relationship and creating solutions together, and not just asking people to sign off on what we've created or what we're concerned about, right? So the question is really for both residents and professional practitioners on the line about ideas that you have that for us to be able to work together in different ways that benefit everybody. How can we work together in new ways to provide the housing that we need in our community?
I'd like to. Yeah, well, I mean, somewhat around all three of those questions. The first is obviously we need a lot more people in the process, which we're already talking about here. And I do think that the people we need in the process are people who just aren't traditionally there. I mean, we do have to use, what I see as promising in a toolkit is trying to figure out as many low-tech ways as possible. Many people don't get the newspaper, they don't read, you know, they don't, but they do go to the grocery store. And if you have a flyer there, or, you know, just churches, right? What you can put in a bulletin, and how can you somehow reach out to people who do those levels of things, you know, in groups or even smaller community-based organizations, right? Where people, promotores have, you know, have outreach into different neighborhoods and with people. And often those are ways we can get people into the discussion. And if we give them the right narrative, we'll not be afraid to be in the discussion, because there is a fear of getting yourself involved with government or businesses when that has not been, you know, your cultural norm. And the other part of that is we have to have developers in the conversation, and they have to have us in their conversations. You know, it's a little frightening to me, and I'm wonderful about the work that's going on the East Side, but there are $500,000, $600,000 homes, and those are some of the only homes that you can buy, you know, off of Martin Luther King Boulevard. Again, that's a little frightening to me. And when we talk about affordable housing, I think that's great. But what kind of affordable housing are we talking about? Are we just talking about renting again? Or are we talking about helping low-income people create wealth, right? Purchase. Okay, so I can't afford a whole house, but how about a co-op community, right? Because now everyone has some ownership and responsibility along with that. So I think the toolkit is great, and it is, and I think there's even more and more that it will, you know, grow, and that it can be extremely useful. And I do think we not only need to think about, you know, other people who can be in this conversation that have never been, but we also need to talk about the people who usually lead the conversation, which is developers and realtors and other people who, you know, everyone perceives as professional in the development of communities, but in fact, over time, through both the development of planning and through all of the, you know, from the federal government down, have actually created, you know, the segregation in our cities. So we have to figure out how to sort of, you know, we know that that's still the chain, but how do we, in using this toolkit, what are all the things we can use to start to integrate ourselves, insert ourselves into that process, and have them need us in their process. So
I think that's a fantastic point. I think one of the things that you brought up for me, Janice, is who's actually using the toolkit, right? And who's leading the meetings, right? And we might have assumed that the persons that are using these tools or implementing these tools are.
Hey, Damien, I think you might need to turn off your video because your connection is unstable. But Carla, I see Elizabeth has her hand up if you want to comment.
Hi, can you, is this, okay, I'm good. So I have a question. So this is just, last night I was in a meeting with my city planner and a committee of folks that we've put together because we're trying to do a plan for some redevelopment of some industrial property that could potentially go to housing with an affordable overlay zone. And, you know, we heard from the architect and all these wonderful options. But the reality is that in order to, and part of what they gave us as the presentation was a bit of like a pro forma in terms of like what would and wouldn't work. And like, as an example, they said, you know, if we force retail to be part of this, you know, it isn't going to work because it actually brings the project down. And all the wonderful things that we had talked about in the beginning about, you know, a potential for a Habitat for Humanity project, or, you know, the potential for, you know, just like small business space for people that, you know, maybe are street vendors and might want to like move into a cooperative type of packing house. I mean, they were really just ideas, but the idea was like, how do we make space and keep opportunity in this community, which the borderline, you know, the border of this industrial area is a low income Hispanic community. And the presentation that we saw, it was fine, it was great, but it really just left me thinking, how are we going to pay for this? Because they basically, all the options that they showed us, now granted it was form-based, you know, it didn't include anything that we had talked about for wanting to, you know, kind of make space and create opportunity. And it's because there's no money. Like, there's just no money. And so this is so important. It's so important. But I almost am worried that we're going to overpromise and underdeliver, because we're going to vision and create and talk about opportunity and talk about making space. But at the end of the day, if we don't have money to build, you know, to heavily subsidize those first-time home buyer programs for people that are making 50% or under of area median income and actually build that wealth, it's just smoke and mirrors.
Well, and excuse me for maybe speaking from, again, a place of like miseducation, but I do think that that's another place where, at least for myself as I'm learning, there needs to be more transparency, because when I hear about these development projects, in my mind, right, there's a disconnect. You're hearing from the community that we need more affordable housing, more subsidies, and yet I also feel like the professionals, right, because people defer to professionals as knowing what's best typically, is that, well, we can't necessarily do that, or that it'd be better if we built these high rises that are more expensive and maybe bring in more income. But to me, that doesn't make sense, because now you're displacing the community who's already here, who could also still be paying for a different kind of property, or creating local businesses and cycling that money through the community. And so now I'm here with questions about, well, why isn't this possible, and where can we get the money? And I think that's a frank discussion that needs to be held publicly, instead of, you know, being timid about the economics of it all. I hope that makes sense.
Those are all great points. I think I like to just mention a couple of things that planning, I think most of the developments that come in, obviously the end motivation is profit, right? So we really have to engage the community on what's needed and what's there, and also thinking about how we can bring resources. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of resources for home ownership. Only $40,000, $50,000 from the local government, which doesn't go very far. So how do we make sure we have community serving developments that are addressing community needs? It's a great conversation to have. And on the chat, I did see a comment by Karen that talked about a development up in Northern California that had some mixed use and affordable housing. And those are some of the ideas I think that we should really think about. It's like, well, are there, for example, in a city that we're working with, we're talking about affordable housing rental. Yes, we know it's not homeownership, but with the current crisis on housing, homeownership is not affordable to a lot of folks. So how do we keep them in our community? And on top of that, how do we use the ground floor retail that may not be a profit giving type of situation for a for-profit developer? How do you use those spaces for community innovation? So how do you build businesses? How do you do incubators? Is there a community kitchen that you can do where caterers can actually use that to do their own businesses or stuff like that, right? So I think that's the conversation that we really need to have. Really appreciate your perspective on that.
I wanted to, there's a message from Lupe Camacho. She wants to comment. So Lupe, if you want to go ahead and comment, go right ahead. And Damien, I see that you're back, so we'll catch you up right now. But I wanted to say that one of the reasons why I joined the census outreach was precisely this comment that Elizabeth made. I was able to understand that one of the main reasons why money was not coming to our cities was the undercount of our residents. And that really affects the way that we apply for money and grants. And also, I have seen, through that work, many cities that struggle even with having grant writing staff that can bring the money that could make a difference. So, we also have to advocate for our cities and the city staff and the work that we are trying to do, not just by relying on government officials and staff, because they are overwhelmed. They do need our guidance and support and resources and relationships. So those are things that we can bring to the table that they appreciate. And learning to work together is another. Anybody else that raised their hand? I don't see Lupe coming online, but any other professional or resident that would like to speak up, or Damien, if you want to ask another question, that's also fine.
I don't know where we left off. I apologize for that. But if there's no other comments from where we left off, I think the last question would be, what are we willing to, or what do we think that we need to do to commit to doing with this toolkit next?
All right. I see Karen Martin's hand up. Is it related to this question, or Karen?
Well, yes. I don't know whether you changed questions as I was trying to figure out where the hand raise was, so I apologize. But yes, I would like to suggest that I love this toolkit, and I think being able to put it on our LinkedIn, I was gonna, if that's okay with the creators of the toolkit, put it on our LinkedIn pages, and then if we like it, so it starts trending, I thought that might be very helpful. I'm so grateful that you're doing this. That was my thing.
We're so happy that you're here and that you like the toolkit, because we put a lot of really hard work into it, and we had a lot of community members give feedback. So this is great. And yes, that is an amazing way to keep the work going, is to connect with all the attendees here and keep the momentum going on social media, but also invite us to come and do this presentation to your cities and to your counties, and to open up the conversation with the toolkit that is precisely for that. We just want to open up the conversation. Does the toolkit have all the answers? No, we definitely don't. We're just starting. So maybe that's the way that we can continue the work, that we can commit to at least inviting us or inviting somebody to do a presentation on this toolkit. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I will ask our city to have you come do a presentation, even a Zoom presentation. We need it.
Excellent. We'll be happy to be there.
Fantastic. And I saw that Tom committed to sending this to all of the elected officials in the region, or at least being a part of that, or that's what needs to happen. That's a great idea. Quinn, I see that you're off mute. Did you have something to add?
Oh, no. At present, I think I saved the toolkit and some of the other resources. I want to be able to look over, I'm trying to be present in the conversation. I want to be able to look over them appropriately and kind of think about what ways I can disseminate it through my own networks, and look at who the toolkit's really for. At least, with the work that I'm doing with the Listening Post Collective, I do believe that there are some local organizations that if they're not here in attendance, I can kind of get that out to. I did want to leave a last thought about the outreach efforts of city officials in a sense of putting those publications out into also not as like non-traditional medias. So or media providers. I feel that ethnic-led organizations and news providers such as Black Voice News or local leaders like Wallace Allen could have a huge role in, and also churches could have play a huge role in reaching audiences. Someone had mentioned faith-based organizations earlier and their sort of pamphlets, for lack of the correct word. And I think that is something that needs to be utilized, as well as my own efforts. So that's all I have.
So I want to share with everybody that here in the Inland Empire, we revived our Inland Empire media table, and now it's a media table that's helping with different projects in the city. And they were able to fold in KVCR, PBS, and NPR with very small local media that is Spanish or Vietnamese, or connects with residents in that way. I'm gonna put the link to this table on the side, because this is something that will help our communities regionally, but it's also something that can expand easily. If there's something that communicators can do, they can communicate among themselves. It's just a matter of getting them on the same space. So that's another great idea that we could share and we can continue to build on. But as we're coming to a close to our time, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here, for sticking around and having this conversation, for being passionate about your community, for being passionate about this work, for building a better future for everybody, including my daughter, who's a resident of the IE, and she's a teen. And in the next 8 years, she will be an adult making decisions on her own housing and on her own destiny. And I hope that we can build a region where she can thrive along with every other little citizen, big citizen, old citizen. Everybody should be able to thrive here. And it's because of the work that we do together. It doesn't happen magically. Nobody's going to tell you have a seat and we'll build a beautiful city for you and you can just come out and enjoy it. No, it takes time, it takes investment, and it takes unity. So we really thank you for being here. The Center for Social Innovation is really proud of the work we're doing, but we're more proud of the work we're doing because it's informed by community members. And we look forward to the next time that we see each other. And I will be in touch. Invite us.